will hopefully do an appalling job, so you'll all think I can do much better than this. So as I said, it was very much a learning experience. So I don't know if you're kind of aware, there's the 4 stages of competency. So there's like this kind of unconscious incompetence where you're blissfully ignorant. You've no idea about the thing. You're completely unaware about this stuff, and then you kind of go to stage 2, which is you kind of become consciously incompetent. So you're aware that you know nothing. So you kind of decide you need to start a learning journey, and then you kind of have this conscious competence where you think you've worked out. You can struggle through. You can work through most of your problems. You can work out, and then stage 4 is this kind of unconscious competence. So this is a magic Zen state that you just can basically fire out the code and you can just work. You know everything. You just know everything. So in this kind of Vue journey, I very much found myself kind of floating between all 4 of these stages. So it's like there's moments of like I've really got this. I understand this, and then suddenly something happens and it just all goes to pot. You have no idea what's going on. So this has been very much my kind of Vue journey, and in preparing for this talk, there's been a few things that I've kind of picked up and learned as I've gone along. So if there's any questions, or if anybody has any kind of similar experience, feel free, just shout, and we can just discuss it basically. So yeah, Vue.js. So it started off with this guy Evan You. He worked for Google, and he worked a lot with Angular. So this is his quote: "I have no idea which bit he really liked about Angular, because I think there's probably more than one bit about it that he quite liked, but he essentially thought he could do better. He could do something that was a little bit simpler, a little bit lightweight. So he created Vue.js in, I'm looking at my notes, so mid-2013. That's when it kind of started, and then version 2 came out October 2015. So we're currently in version 2.6. So it was about a year or so from 2.5, so it's quite stable. They are busy rewriting it, and with kind of this is very much JavaScript, so they are rewriting it apparently with more of the TypeScript and not monitoring it. But version 3 will be done when it's done. So no idea when that's going to be. But what they have been very good at, from version 1 to version 2, they wrote a lot of utilities and tools that allowed people to easily upgrade. And they've certainly promised that with version 3, there'll be tools and stuff to make the upgrade easier. And just automatically, if it knows it can do something, it'll just automatically do it. So anybody that's thinking about it, don't be kind of put off by version 3 is just coming. You can probably dive straight in 2.6, fire stuff out, and then the upgrade path will hopefully be fairly painful, unlike I think some of the upgrade paths with other libraries. But then best intentions and all that, the reality could be completely different. So please don't take my word for it. So what is Vue.js? I suspect most of you probably know. It's a JavaScript framework, yet another JavaScript framework. I did try and look and see how many there were, and I discovered there's kind of this world of inception where you've got JavaScript frameworks based on JavaScript frameworks. I can't remember which one is based on Vue, but there is a framework that is based on Vue where somebody's went, I'm going to build a framework on top of Vue. So there's many out there. We've probably all used, or at least seen some of them. So there's the big names like React and Angular. I know some folk use Aurelia. So it's very much the same. It's not too dissimilar. It's just JavaScript. So one of the big things that kind of I worked out, it is just JavaScript. So to get going, it is really simple. There's no compilers. You can literally just write. You can use Notepad. You can write hello world.html, embed the script in, pull in the main library, and you're away. It is that simple. And I think, there's a conversation earlier. I think that's probably partly why it's quite popular, because it's so easy to start playing about with, getting a feel for it, seeing what it can do, and it's so easy to get up and running with it. And I think that's part of the appeal, and it's very simple and minimal. So by default, it literally doesn't do very much. It does data binding, and that's pretty much it. It does the templating basically. There's nothing else that it does. To get additional functionality, you have to pull in other libraries. You have to add to it. There's plenty of other libraries out there, so you kind of build up your preference of libraries and components, and you end up with your preferred thing. So the reality is that even though it's simple and minimal, you'll probably end up pulling larger libraries in. So you'll probably end up hitting the same sizes as likes of Angular. I can't remember the size off the top of my head, but and it's progressive. Yes, that's the point. So it doesn't do routing. It doesn't have its own networking. You would bring in libraries as you wish to use that. So it's progressive. You can add to it. So it wouldn't be code. It wouldn't be a talk without code. So this is a hello world. This is it. And this is all the code you're going to see tonight. It's not. So this is a basic hello world, as you can see. So I'll kind of talk through the main bits, and then we'll kind of dive into Visual Studio, and we'll start to pull it in, and we'll start to kind of build up and see what the core JS stuff can do. We'll not focus on any of the routing or any Vuex. We'll maybe mention it, and we can answer questions and discuss it if we wish, but we're just kind of going to focus on the main Vue bit. So it probably doesn't look too dissimilar to most stuff you'll see. We have the markup. That's it. The key parts here, we're pulling in Vue.js. So there's a few ways you can pull it in, but the simplest way assumes it's sitting next to this HTML document. So we pull in the main library. We pull in our wonderful app, which we'll see in its amazing complicatedness in a moment. The app is defined by this element. So essentially what Vue will do is, we'll see in the next slide, it's got an ID, so what Vue will do is essentially attach itself to this, and the magic will happen, and part of that magic is a data binding here. So we're using, in this case here, the mustache syntax for double curly braces to bind to a particular property. In this case, it's called message. And here's our app. So we've just created a new instance of it. It uses the object syntax, so there's a number of properties, but we've gone with the simplest we can get. We can see there's the element name, which should match that one there. So this Vue instance will attach itself to that, and it will have the amazing message, hello world. And that will appear. So that's the Vue instance. That's the element name that we talked about. And that's our message. So Vue with ASP.NET. So how many people work with ASP.NET? Quick show of hands. So hopefully this project will look quite similar. You're all kind of MVC, all familiar with MVC, that those have done it? Nodding heads in some web forums. Sucks to be you. So there's a few options to get it. We can pull it in from a CDN. We've seen it's just reference that. We could use libman. So this is something that I've seen and totally forgot about, and then saw it again when I was preparing for this. So libman is a nice way to pull in JavaScript dependencies. NPM, and we're getting into scary territory here. With NPM, you're kind of starting in this world of packaging, and you have processors. So you're probably going to Webpack or something like Bower, although Bower thinks being deprecated. So Webpack. And how many people have worked with Webpack? How many people love working with Webpack? Yeah, nobody. So it's quite a scary beast. When it works, it's beautiful. But then when it doesn't work and you've no idea what's going on, you're doomed. Well, at least I am anyway. And there's another option that we'll kind of come back to at the very end. There's the Vue CLI, and we can use a bit of middleware. So let's do a demo, and this is where it all goes pear-shaped. So this should look a familiar project. Can everybody see? Yeah, hopefully. So what I've done here is I've just created a very simple app. So it's super complicated. This is my rival to Amazon. So I was coming up with I think that one of the hardest things coming up with a talk is not so much the content of the talk. You can go off in tangents and learn new stuff. It's really quite cool. But the worst thing is coming up with a demo, like something that's not too in depth, something that's a little bit more interesting. So just coming up with like a little mini domain, a mini application, and unfortunately the best I could do was a bookshop. So yeah. So here was my wonderful bookshop. So all I did is I basically used the default template to start off with. I've created a new page. I know I want a book list there, so I've obviously put a to-do in. I have, because I know I want to be kind of all web and stuff, I have created an API. So a super complicated API that gets me in my list of books. So there we go. Dates, I know dates are always a popular subject. I have a date that is a date. I am using Node@time, and I have chosen to serialize that in year, month, day, just because that is simple. So hopefully that will work in my front end. Yeah, so I've got a list of books. That's it. So I was talking about libman. So as we were saying, there's a few ways we can pull in Vue, and I've lost my notes. Back. There we go. So by default, the template sticks all your dependencies in this lib folder, and they're kind of like pinned at the version. So in here, it has been excluded, and you will see the ones that we're coming to. The reason they're there is I didn't know if the internet would work, but now I know it works. I can maybe be bold. Maybe not delete the folder. So the template pulled in Bootstrap and everything, and it pinned it to a particular version, but it's kind of not obvious and easy for upgrading. We might want different versions if we're using development versus production, and we want an easy way to pull stuff in. So there's a tiny little menu that you may not have ever noticed called Manage Client-Side Libraries. So this is undoubtedly the easiest and quickest way to pull in JavaScript dependencies. You don't need to worry necessarily about CDNs. You could use the stuff that's built into Visual Studio to kind of have backups, but we'll not go into details of that. But the quickest way, it should have IntelliSense, and this is where we hope it works. So this libman, I think it was Mads that created this, and I think if we mostly work with like .NET and C# code. I think client-side stuff tends to be quite scary because we feel like we don't have control over it. JavaScript's quite crazy and stuff. So back in the days, you used to pull in like jQuery through NuGet, and that worked. But the problem with that is it's kind of quite tightly ingrained into the project, and lots of things can go wrong, and it's not without its problems. So this extension was created to kind of simplify that. It's this stage where Webpack is far too much. You're really just interested in pulling down somebody else's libraries. You want to know when there's updates, and you just basically want to have a nice simple way. So hopefully, if the IntelliSense is warmed up, there we go. So what we can do, yay for IntelliSense, is hopefully pull in Vue, and it should find the versions. There we go. So this is going away and using some magic to find the versions, and this is getting this from CDN.js. So this tool does support a number of providers. It uses the other one that unpacks from NPM, I think. And then we can tell this where to go. That's in a polite way, not in a rude way, so we'll stick it in www, I think. Lib, and I think it would be Vue. So when I save this, what should happen is you should see this little thing down here, and it should go away, and it should restore it, and we should see, yay, it pulling down Vue.js. So it's taken down a few different flavors. So that's the easiest way to get Vue, and that's what we've done here. So I'm going to focus mainly just on one view. I'm going to kind of keep the noise of all the other project stuff to a minimum, just because we kind of all know what it is. But this project has got the default. So in the layout, we can see it's pulling in scripts here. And we have got the development switch. So there's a few ways we could stick our script in. We could stick it in here and perhaps pull it down from a CDN. We could pull it in from that local package. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my wonderful page, and we're just going to pull it in here. So good old copy and paste. In fact, it might be a snippet. There we go. So I've pulled, oops, missed. So is everybody aware of this section script? Everybody shaking the head? No, color face. So I'll go through it. So it's kind of a way to, with how MVC works, it's kind of subfolders and stuff. So there's always a concept of a parent, well, not always, there's a concept of a parent. And by doing this, what this does is it will look in the parent views for this particular section, and it will essentially inject this script here. I'm pointing on my screen, you can't see that. This script here into, in this case here, it will be this section here. So it's right at the bottom, so it's where JavaScript should be apparently. Yeah, so we've got our pulled in view, and then we need to just pull in our new instance. So this is probably a little bit familiar. So there's loads of stuff going on here. So I'm just creating a new instance of Vue. As I mentioned in the intro, it uses this object syntax. So there's lots of stuff that we kind of don't really care about just now, but it's kind of good to go through the life cycle. In fact, let's do that now. So when you create the instance, it goes through this life cycle, not too dissimilar to most things really. It has the concept of it being created. It goes through a test of memory. It goes through the mounted, and then you end up with your component, your instance, and it kind of sits in this loop. And how Vue works is it's kind of reactive. So can you see that? Maybe not. Make it big. So when you create a new instance of Vue or a component, it's exactly the same. It goes through this, and for each event, there's a before. So I've got the before created. There's a before mounted as well. There's a before update, and then on the way out, there's disposed. So this is the kind of magic state here where it's created your component. It's done all its smart stuff with your template. And it will sit there and it will monitor the instance, and it's got watches, and this is the kind of reactive thing. So it will detect when there's changes to properties. It's got this kind of virtual DOM or shadow DOM, which I think sounds quite nice and sinister. It will sit there and it will kind of work out what needs to change, and then it will reflect those changes back into the actual browser. So as we have updates, what happens is there's an update, it'll work out what's changed, and it'll go back into the view. So we've got that wonderful thing going on. And then when you kill the component, when it kind of disappears out of existence, it should tidy up, and there's a whole destroyed sequence so that you could jump in and do further tidying up if required, and then it's basically gone. And then when we create it, we go through this cycle again, before create. And I'm just going to do that again because I quite like this little animation. I cannot take any credit for this. I found it on the internet and added a checkbox, so it's now mine. So that's how it works. Yeah, so we've got a very simple application there. And my thing's not charging because it's fallen out. I'm going to blame somebody. I know it was me. I was going to blame somebody else, but I can't. Yeah, so I will skip ahead. So I was trying to be smart there. So what I've done is I've used branches to kind of progress through each of the stages. So I've always got a nice way to kind of end up back at the beginning. This is what real development's all about, just restarting Visual Studio and cursing your tools. Really? We all need to cross our fingers and pray to the demo gods. There we go. Right, so come on, wake up. Yeah, so what we should have seen me is I've pulled in Vue. I've started to create a simple app, and if you'd watched me write the code, Git. Who knows Git? Where's Gary when you need him? Does anybody know the shortcut, by the way? Just so you, in the address bar, you can type in CMD or PowerShell, or somebody know that? Yeah. That was a wee while ago.
Do you delete your working folder to fix a Git problem here?
No, it's what's. In fact, can I do this way?
Should be any changes in Teams Explorer.
Yay, thank you. My Git Foo is not strong. We use TFS mainly, so that's why. Soft. Right, here we go. So, back on it. Yeah, this is me. This is my store listing. Right. So, we kind of briefly saw the life cycle of Vue there. So this is the actual application that I've done. So we've got an API endpoint. So I'm just using the normal fetch, which is essentially Ajax, to get data. As I was talking about, Vue is very progressive. So the networking library a lot of people prefer to use with Vue is Axios. So just to keep it simple, I've not bothered with that. Axios is quite good because you can kind of have on your instance, you can essentially have a property that is Axios. You can put in error handling, you can put in rules, you can add headers. So if you are doing any cross-site stuff or any kind of extra anti-forgery stuff, you can inject into the actual pipeline and do some extra stuff. But our app is so simple. It's hosted in the same project. If we have got authentication here, it will be cookie authentication. So this works for us. So I've got my book list. It's very much the same what you see. I go fetch my data from the API. I read the JSON and I stick it in the books collection there. And here's my template. So one of the cool things about Vue is kind of like really obvious templating. So as developers, we can really kind of look at this and pretty much work out what it's doing. We've got a for loop. So we're saying for each book in books, great, we want to do this. We've got some bindings going on. So because I've now got this book object, if we look at the API, we'll see it's got all these properties on it. So I've got the title, description and price, as you'd expect. So that will come down, and as we kind of saw in the life cycle, that's happening in the mounted event. There's not much reactivity going on here. Vue will, as it loads, it will essentially look at the data, look at the properties you've got, and it will start to observe these things. So one of the things that's quite important is Vue needs to know about them. So if you've got very dynamic data, you can kind of end up creating properties or objects, and if it happens after the mounted event, Vue's totally unaware of it. So what happens is it will never bind. So you'll be changing it left, right, and center, and it just never updates. And the right way Vue has a couple of helper methods in the instance. I think it's like set. You typically would never need to use that, but it's kind of important to know that as the instance is created, Vue will only really be aware about these things. So when we set this collection, it's aware of that collection. If we were to add things to it, it would hopefully pick that up. So let's run this amazing store and see what it looks like. Work out which page I'm on. And I lost my eyes, there we go. So here's my store. But what can I notice? There's a few funny things going on there. So I don't know if you noticed, but it kind of flashed a little bit. And we've got kind of quite poor formatting. We understand what that data is because we're developers, but if customers come to my wonderful site, they'll probably be a bit confused. There's a few things going on we really want to kind of address. So that funny flickering thing, I don't know if you quite see it. So what I will do is just to exaggerate it. Will this work? So I've just put that in a timeout. So what will happen is after 5 seconds, this will mount Vue into our magic. So let's refresh this. And you can see, we can see our template there. So that's kind of not ideal. So this is because the elements that I have attached to are actually in the DOM. So the browser is just going to basically render what it sees. So Vue has got this concept of cloaking. So between a bit of styling and a decorator, because Vue uses a lot of decorators, we can hopefully do a cloak. And then if we do this again, and all that does is it basically applies a fail. I probably don't have the styles. If I had the style, it will appear in the next one. What would happen is it wouldn't appear. You'll just have to take my word for it. In fact, let's skip forward. So the other thing we mentioned was formatting. So these V hyphen things, they're decorators. So they'll kind of pop up every now and again, and V4 is one. So they're just kind of like augmenting the HTML functionality to do something. And it really depends on what it is. So that's the V-cloak one there. And between that and the style, what will happen is the style will hide that, and then when Vue's done its thing, it will basically remove the V-cloak, and then as if by magic, it will appear. But the other thing we were interested in is formatting. So we can create formatters, and they are just functions, and we can pipe input through. They're called filters, and I think like at first you kind of think, well, a filter, that doesn't kind of suggest it does data formatting, but that's what they do. So I've created a very simple couple of filters, and as I said, they are just functions, and they, in this object syntax, they live in here. So at the moment, they can only be used by my component. But that's fine because we've not got much else going on. And all it really does is it will just use JavaScript state. Because it's in that friendly format, it'll be magically picked up as a date, and it does two-date string. So hopefully get a friendlier syntax. And then just a bit, so I guess it's similar to C#'s func, is it? Where the first argument is kind of the main thing, and then you kind of have like extra ones. Filters can have that. So in this case here, we could use the money one, and we can provide extra parameters to essentially add extra options to it. So in this case here, I don't have any options, so it will just take the default, which we can see is pounds, and it will assume 2 decimal places. So I have no idea what Visual Studio is doing with that. Let's hide that, pretend it didn't happen. So let's see that. So if anybody from work's watching this, my laptop's slow, I need an upgrade. Yeah, so we can see we've got our formatting. So a little bit a little bit more friendly for our users. And we could prove that if we provide, just as you kind of expect, because we're now going all international, and we don't convert currencies, we'll just take the hit. Oops, I did the wrong one. Dollar is clearly not and it should be a string. Can't believe nobody picked that up. You all failed my test. Noted. So we can see we've just changed that filter. So filters are kind of quite good, but the reality is that you probably wouldn't really have filters like this just in your component because you're going to be copying and pasting code. So Vue has this kind of like global registration where you can just in here, you can create new filters. So hopefully IntelliSense is working. I'm completely powerless without IntelliSense now. So if I wanted to make these a bit more reusable, I would essentially just move my function into here. Which one was that? The date. And that would make it reusable. But with how I've got this set up in this very kind of fake example here, the reality is you would probably promote this up into your main scripts folder. If you're writing your own filters, the Vue has this curated list. It's a vast number of components and filters. There's, I think, 2 or 3 that relate with formatting stuff. So you might want to maybe look at one of them. But obviously, if you pull them in, you will probably increase your size. So sometimes you might only need date and number, date and money. So you'd probably do this and roll your own. But there's a kind of vast ecosystem of other people doing stuff. Anything else in here that's of significance? Probably not right now. So any kind of questions? I'm looking at the time and I'm...
See, you just changed that to a global filter. Does it still work? Or you said, how do you reference that global filter in here?
So because I'm running it. You just by name? Just by name. So I take that. Yeah. So it's essentially registered in the global instance. This is like kind of a bit like a factory, I guess. So you would configure it all up, and that's your default. So when I create a new instance, there is essentially a filters object with, in this case, a date function, a function called date that will do this. And in every single Vue object that's created as just doing new Vue, or when you can create components, it will go through the same thing. That becomes available kind of globally. So it's kind of my filter will be all the way down, and then that's just done the global config there. Yeah, there we go. So you sounded quite skeptical as if it would work, so I'll just prove it works. I sense you.
I forgot what the view looks like actually. I just it's fine.
Yes. Yeah, so we're kind of touching on the components there. So Vue is essentially Vue objects all the way down. Everything's a Vue object pretty much. So at the top level, you'll create a new instance of Vue. You'll have components, which are instances of Vue. They'll have a template normally. So you'll see on our first one, we had this element name. You could swap this out for a template. And Vue's kind of quite opinionated in the fact that it likes everything to be together. I know that there's other things that very much separate the code from the template. But Vue's opinion is that they should be very close together. And it kind of makes sense, and that's one of the nice things. So when you're working with it, you would normally kind of create you could either create your template in line. So I kind of need the element there, but I could use a template. And I should be able to actually provide markup in here. But writing markup in there isn't very obvious, it isn't very nice. The other thing you could do is you could actually write your template in here as a template. And because it's a template, and I've said template a lot, you would provide an ID for it, and then what Vue would do is it would essentially pull in that template. It wouldn't be rendered in the actual browser. It would be sent down. It would be processed with the browser, so the browser will go through it and work it all out. But it wouldn't display, so you wouldn't kind of get that flickering experience. So a lot of the time, if you were building something larger, your root instance is very simple. It would probably be an empty div, and then the things down there would have their templates. The Vue's got these single files that is really nice to work with. So it's essentially a single file that has 3 sections. And I'll skip ahead. Hopefully. So we've got one here. But because we were all scared of Webpack, I've not got Webpack, so that kind of gives us a problem. I want to work with these files, but these files are essentially compiled. So there's 2 elements to Vue. There's like the runtime part and there's the not runtime part. So the not runtime part will compile these Vue files traditionally and bundle them up and package them with this render function. Or you could have so that's what it does. So, but to do that, we need Webpack. And we kind of started off really quite simple, and we're not going to have that very many components. So there's this other library, and this is really not to be used in production, but it's quite, or I didn't say that. If you had a large scale thing, you probably wouldn't want to use it. If you're pottering about, playing with it, you want to prove concepts to maybe other people within your company and see how Vue might work. This would work really well. You can rapidly kind of prototype. So I've created a book component, and in here, you can kind of see what I was talking about. We have the template part, and we have the script part. So this is, as our main component, this is exactly the same, so it follows the same object. It's pared down. We're not interested in the element, because by convention, it knows the template's here. I have the methods that I've pulled across. That's all it is. So what will happen is, through this third-party component that I've again pulled in through libman, it will pull down this, it will render it all client-side, do all the magic, and we can see we swapped out our big, huge template just for something a lot simpler. So we've now got a component that we could potentially reuse every time we want to display a book. We bind a property, and this would be observable, so that as the book changes, the component would update. And that's kind of all there is to see about that. Yeah. If you weren't wanting to pull it in, the alternative would be, let's see if I've got that, just so we can see that. Nope. So the alternative way, rather than pulling in, is one thing that will catch you out when you do Vue is this concept of a single root element. So all templates want to have a single root element. So you'd normally go for a div. If you were doing a simple input, you could just have the input. But I couldn't have a second div sitting alongside that. Vue complains, and it's kind of weird, but you get used to it. So what I'm going to do is, because I've got this property next to it, I can do book.title. And then hopefully that will work. Equally, that could be a template, as I was saying, defined within the markup. And that's another kind of good way. But it kind of doesn't scale. So when we first started out in our Vue adventure, we've got a very complicated screen. And there's lots of components on it. And we discovered, because it renders every time, because it kind of goes through this life cycle of building this render function every time the component is created, and we ended up with so many components, we really got a kind of big performance hit. So by kind of switching to using Webpack, I don't know how much quicker it is because there's other changes we're doing, but we kind of in a kind of dummy environment, we proved it was potentially like 30% quicker. So it is quite a lot slower, but you know, as I said, if you're kind of like experimenting with it, want to prove a concept, build a prototype, you probably don't need to worry about it that much. This works. And then, as I was saying, I could move this out into a template just to prove that it works. I don't know, what does Angular do in terms of its templating? Does anybody know? I haven't worked with Angular, so. And because I've not used it, Vue, obviously. So what I can do is I can just change this, and because it has got an ID, what will oops. This should still work and look as beautiful as it does. Yeah. So that's a couple of ways to get templates in.
You said that's slower than which way?
So if you actually compiled this, so this would be the slowest out of all the, well, it depends what this does, but this would be slower than having the template inline. And the reason it's slower than the template inline is because the browser will have to parse all of this. I mean, there's not a huge amount there, but as this comes down, all browsers, even though it's a template, will parse it. Even though they don't render it, they'll go through it all, work out what's there, and do that. Whereas if it was in here, as we had it there, the browser does not have to deal with it, but every time that component is created, it would have to generate that render function. And that's essentially what that is doing. So this is using the developer type thing to generate that render function.
So if you use the component once, there's no difference between those two, but if you use it multiple times,
then it will start to mount up. And this particular component is registered globally. In this object syntax, if you had a component that you were only using once, rather than registering it globally, you might choose to stick it in here, so there should be components. This is where I misspell something, probably. And then again, that just takes an array of, or a list, an object. So it's object syntax. So if I had a component called foo, I would pass it in like that. But I don't. That's missing. Should always have foo. Right. Yeah, so components are quite good, but I think for me, one of the big powerful things about Vue is slots. And slots is kind of like Vue's, I guess, kind of superpower, really. It's kind of like, it's a way of kind of injecting and providing data out. So we had created our book component. And you can imagine that there's probably a lot going on in my component. It's doing it, becomes responsible for things, and including this very complicated computed property. So how computed properties work is they are just like properties. They're just like bits of data, but they are reactive. So what would happen is if we were to change anything about this book, what Vue would do is it would identify maybe the price has changed, so it would cause a re-render for anything that uses this. This template is one way, so we'll not actually see that. But that's kind of like the good thing about Vue. So what I've done is I've created a slot for my book because it transpires I'm not very good at design. And my original layout might not be good for anybody who's want to reuse my super complicated logic that's going on in this component. I've made a slot. So this is a scoped slot. A scoped slot, you can provide extra properties. So this is a way of basically saying, I have this bit of space here that you can put something in. I've chosen to put in a default content, but if you want, you can provide something else. And when you provide something else, I will give you two bits of information. That first one is a book, which is the particular property, and I've got my super complicated computed property that works out if it's on offer. So that means that somebody can come along and use my component. They're much better at design than me. And then we can provide this alternative template. So we've got another directive, vslot. And this is basically saying for the vslot default, you can have multiple. So we could have a header and a footer. You can have as many slots as you like. But I'm going to pull out those slot props. And that is an object that will have those two things on it. So I can use a vif, so that's another directive. Vif is quite good because what we'll do is anything under here will not be rendered. It is a complete stop. So if you've got complicated components, if you have a vif, they'll not go through the life cycle. There'll be no overhead of that. The alternative to VIF would be a vShow. That just basically hides it applies a hidden style to it. It would go through the life cycle, go through the thing, it would just simply not show. So where possible, you'd want to use a VF. So it's obviously really complicated because when it's an offer, I just want to see a big picture of fire. When it's not, I just want to see a book. So here, I've completely changed this component in its appearance, but I'm using some of the important bits of functionality that I've decided should be there. So we've kind of ended up with a completely different view. And there's a lot of like third-party components that use slots really well. So the Vuetify controls kind of pretty much work this out perfectly. You can change a lot of the elements, a lot of the look and feel of the controls. So you can, when you've got complex objects, if it's a drop down, you can change the way the drop down looks. So I think that's kind of definitely Vue's superpower is the slot. So I've got an alternative design here that shows when it's on offer. Or I can't buy it, so that's a bit of a flaw in my design. So maybe it's not the best. But you can kind of see the power of the slot. So I think it is kind of a really smart thing. I am not selling it enough. So we've seen the binding, and we can kind of prove that it's two-way. So just for the record, the only reason I'm not using the black theme in here is so you can see it better. But I am a proper developer because I have got the black theme in my dev tools, just so you know. It's just what I should be able to do is what is it called? It's called app, isn't it? So that is my Vue instance that I've newed up here. Where is it? Yeah, so I've called it app. So that's actually available in here. So I can kind of prove that it's reactive by probably changing the title. So we can see the dev tools have provided me. Can you see that? It's quite hard to see. There we go. We can see the titles there, but we'll obviously want to change it. And you can see what I like to use. Vue. So the magic stuff has kind of gone on. Vue is observing that property. It has changed the title. But that's a very kind of poor example. And the reality is that we would probably have something more complicated. Two-way binding traditionally means forms, manipulating data. So in true Blue Peter fashion, here is one I've made earlier, and I'm looking at the time. So I have got a request form. So we've seen the kind of very simple bindings where we've used the mustache syntax. But what Vue gives us is this kind of V model. And this is where the binding is really, a lot of people kind of miss. It's props down, events up, and you kind of must remember this. So especially with like complex objects, and you've got to remember the difference between reference types and value types, because that kind of becomes important if you were to bind things. So what's actually happening behind this V model is there's two things. This is a shorthand syntax. So on the way in, it's setting a property called input. And is input, yeah, is input, Gavin? Or value? Value, yeah. Okay, sorry. On the way in, it sets a property called value. So the input has a value property, so it will just set this to this address. It will bind it to that. And then what will happen if there's any changes, what Vue will do is it will emit an event back up, and it will say this value has changed, and then it expects you to do something with that. So you'd normally assign that back to the thing that you're interested. And then what happens would be that kind of goes back down again, but it works out there's no change, so you kind of end up in this equilibrium. So this V model is shorthand syntax for essentially saying property down, and it subscribes to the change event that will set, in this case, the email address to the value emitted. And as I say, with reference types, it kind of becomes quite important because you kind of think you should use V model because that kind of seems a logical thing. But when you assign like X to Y with reference types, you're just assigning the reference. So that means that when you actually change the thing, you're mutating the actual object. And Vue's very against that. You have to set the property and you register the event and you reassign. So with complex objects, if you find yourself creating these kind of controls, you have to clone objects. You have to copy them about. Or you have to not use VModel and basically make it very clear that this particular property is a reference type. So when you set it, whoever changes it, everybody's changing the same instance. Everybody's changing the same reference because it's all the same object. Yeah, so that's kind of quite an important thing that we have missed early on with the stuff we're doing. But with my particular form, you can see I'm typing away, and as if by magic, it's appearing over here. You'll notice this one's not, though. And you kind of think that's a bit weird, but it's not that weird because I have got this one is lazy. So what lazy will do is it will basically not continually update it, and when I tab out of this, you can see that it gets updated. And out of the box, Vue supports a number of controls, and we can see that's updating. And yeah, if you can validate the email. So yeah, so with the two-way binding, things become a lot simpler, especially when you're kind of wanting to use values over here. If you've got validation going on and you want to kind of react to that, you can start doing a lot more things with this kind of MVVM pattern. That if you were writing this with jQuery and you wanted to keep two fields in sync, or have a field that was like a combination of multiple fields, it would just be lots of tedious code that you would, first time you'd nail it, but as you make changes, you'd miss something and you'd end up with these awful little bugs that you kind of miss. So from that point of view, keeping data in sync, this kind of reactive model, this binding, is just so much nicer than the old school way of setting actual field names. The other thing I've done here is I've got this standard input. So you can see here I've kind of started creating the same kind of code, and I've just decided to use the Bootstrap themes because I have no design sense at all. And I've created this standard input control that kind of uses that, and it kind of shows this whole props in and events out a little bit better. So this is not a super complicated control, but there's a couple of things that are kind of going on here. I've got this inherit attributes set to false. So by default, what would happen is if I were to set any attributes on this particular component, and by that I mean, I've got label here. Well, the label is a property. I've got type. I could have class. I could have any kind of normal attributes. By default, Vue will pass it down to the root element. So earlier we talked about you must have a single root element. In this case, here it's a div. So by default, this is to true, which means that any additional property I set will get applied to here. But you can see here I've got a type that I wanted to do here. It's not defined anywhere, but by binding to this magic kind of property, it will pass down that property. So I've created a very extensible component that allows me to pass things down. And you can see here, this is where it's setting the value. And this is what I was talking about emitting the event back out. So this is the kind of the longhand way of what Vue was giving us with that short, the VModel decorator. Does that kind of make sense?
I'm a bit lost.
A bit lost.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe just me. But
So this kind of prop down is it's setting this value on this component on the way in. But when that value changes, it's taking a copy and emitting it back up. So when this emits it back out, it's the parent's VModel that's picking it up. So it will reassign, in this case, our email address to the value that's emitted here. I think when you start playing with about it, it starts to make more sense. But most of the time, you never have to kind of write this, especially with the VModel stuff. But you might have other events that you might emit something. So like be key press. So normally a key press, there's event arguments that you'd associate that you could then pick up. With this special input event, it is just the value that it will emit. making a bit more sense? No.
Just go with it.
Just say.
I was getting it up until that section.
Yeah. So what else have we got here? Yeah. So yeah, what we should see if that's still running and I refresh it, we'll end up with 2 email addresses. Yeah. So crazy binding going on. It's updating both. And now, kind of talking about the events, if I open up, there's an extension which, if you're working with Vue, is really kind of, yeah, you really need this because it allows you to look at all the components. So that's that particular component, but you can track the events. So hopefully, if I type, I didn't do the events, did I? That. I got the wrong component. It should automatically be recording. Oh. Don't know why it wasn't working that one. But you can see that what's happening is as I type, it's emitting an event with that payload, and that payload is the actual value that's changed to. Yeah, so kind of totally running out of time. So the working with Vue this way is kind of all right, but the Vue CLI kind of gives you a much nicer experience. And it does all the Webpack craziness for you. So the let's just use Blue Peter because that's the one that I created earlier. In fact, no, let's not into that long. So you can use the Vue CLI. You install it through npm, and I've chosen to install it globally. So what I can do is just do Vue new, and it should create a. What have I done? That. Yes. I was thinking .NET. Oh, got to give it a name. Yeah, so what the Vue CLI do, it'll ask you a few questions, and I'm just going to go through with the previous ones, but it will say, do you want to use TypeScript? So TypeScript is obviously probably nicer for C# developers. It gives us that type safety. But the problem with using TypeScript is you have to use some sort of compiler, and that's where like Webpack comes in. So to kind of take all that kind of effort and thought about using it, the Vue CLI is basically a nice little template that will get you up and running. It uses the Webpack dev server that will sit, and it will essentially serve up the markup and your JavaScript, and it will just kind of work as if by magic. And what's really nice about it is it gives you this reactivity. So when you update your component and it detects a save, it will automatically, as if by magic, refresh the browser, which is really good because as you kind of potter about with things, you get that really rich feedback. But that's kind of very much against what you would kind of normally expect in this kind of Visual Studio world where things don't quite often work like that. So let me... what we've done. Run serve, yeah. Yeah, there you go. Well done, you win that. Oh, well, just pass it on. Yeah, so what that's doing is it's running a task, npm task, that will do all this magic for us. So now I should be able to go to this super complicated site, which is the default hello world. And I can see there's that. But what's really quite smart about this is, I shouldn't have done it that way. let's just do, totally running out of time. But if I save that, you'll see that that's kind of done something. It's detected the change because it's got a watch and it's updated that component as if by magic. So with Angular and React, Microsoft have, or the community have provided very nice templates that allow you to get up and running with this. So you kind of get this experience, and how it works is essentially it's running on your web server. I think it's probably Kestrel or IIS Express, and it's got special middleware that will essentially start npm. So it will essentially run the npm run serve. It will pick up the port and it will proxy requests that aren't found through to this. So you can kind of have the best of both worlds. If you're kind of, and this is kind of what we're doing, where we're kind of pretty much all in with Vue. We've got a more of a spa. We've using the Vue CLI to give us this kind of nice experience of updating everything, and it's essentially being served through Visual Studio, and so it's kind of got the tools that we're used to, but a better dev experience. So what I'd done earlier is I essentially looked at and I wasn't the first person, I thought it was, but then I looked and I found somebody else had done it. But I looked at, because everything's open source and great, I looked at what Microsoft has provided for the React and Angular experience. And the Angular one was so close to what we needed for Vue. You could literally just change the command, the text it was looking for in the console to pick up the port and proxy through those, proxy through. So what I'd done is I'd create that middleware, and I'd also create a template. So now when I'm kind of pottering about, want to do some new stuff, I can use .NET New and just do Vue. What? I missed the new. That's my test. Well done. I'm running out of these balls. Well held. And that was quick. That was actually quick. And in fact, I'll not open up. And what would it be called? Yeah. So I've totally run out of time, so I can't really give this the kind of justice that it needs. But we can see I've got this client app, which was essentially exactly what the Vue CLI gave us, if it doesn't hide it. So I can see the app somewhere in there. There we go, there's the app. And then in the startup, there's a little bit of extra configuration that pulls, adds a static file. So that basically tells ASP.NET to look in this file for static files, and then it's got a special runtime thing that will proxy through when it's in development, use this CLI server, and then what it'll do is it'll run the npm run task of serve. That will go through and it will restore all the dependencies. It will run that and it will proxy any request that's not been found by the ASP.NET middleware. It will basically proxy it through to that. So when I run this, what we should see is if I change this to build, I should see lots of npm stuff. So you can see it's restoring the dependencies for npm. And it will probably take a few minutes. I should use my Blue Peter one. Yeah, we'll not watch that. So that's quite a nice template. And if anybody wants to use that, I can point you to where you get that from. And I think that kind of works quite well because you end up with a much better kind of Visual Studio friendly experience using some of the cool things that the Vue CLI gives you. And I've kind of like rushed that and missed a few bits, but it's probably a good time to kind of wrap things up just and see if there's any questions or any.
You apply Vue to an existing project that you guys use?
No, so it was a greenfield. It was a greenfield. We've got a component that we're using in the web forms, so it is actually pulling in the Vue component into a web forms application. So that's the other thing you could do. And there's things that you could do with Vue, like if you didn't have to support IE11, there's nice tooling to create web components. So web components are quite interesting. I don't really know how well supported they are, but if you had some amazing little widget that you wanted to use, you can bundle up and package your Vue application, your Vue component, into a web component. So you could just drop, your magic markup into the browsers, and the browsers generally know how to interpret that.
Do you find yourself being more productive using Vue now that you more quicker?
No. Yeah, no. I think that's that. At times, yes. I mean, like, it is a nice developer experience, especially when you're able to. We're mainly, some of us are using code a lot, so we'll use code and we'll open up just a client app and work with that, especially if you're doing a lot of front end stuff. So in that way, it becomes really quite productive because you don't have a lot of the other stuff going on. But there's a lot of things that, for me personally anyway, I'm not naturally a web developer, so there's a lot of things that I kind of like, just CSS and things like that you kind of like battle against, like, oh, this is simple when it's web forms, I understand what's going on, or I wish it was MVC, but there's bits like that. But then when you build really nice components and you can kind of see those slots and actions, and it's quite extensible, you kind of become more productive in other areas, so it's not too bad. I don't know, you've got...
I think one of the most productive things I found was using that single file component, so
Yeah.
Vue syntax. So you kind of get your template, because sounds like traditional kind of folder structures. You've got like okay, some Vue stuff here. You've got like some kind of TypeScript stuff down here, and then like your SAS, your CSS is way up here. They kind of really encourage you to have those things that are relevant together. So like so there's a script block, but there's also the single file also have a style block, and that style block can be scoped to your component. So you can when that actually renders it, renders some like not quite good, but like a unique reference against all these IDs, and it's kind of just having them they're quite close together. It's just really handy.
You seem to imply that Vue is a batteries not included type thing. It's very minimal in focus. Do you end up having to go and grab other libraries?
Yeah, I mean,
and then because they're not included, Angular has a very tight structure and so on. There's a lot in there.
yeah.
You don't have to grab external stuff too much. And all the examples on the internet are all fairly similar.
Yeah.
Whereas with Vue, everybody can go off in different directions.
Yeah, I think that is the kind of thing, is that it says it's really simple and minimalist, but the reality is you're going to pull in probably the Vuetify controls. So the Vuetify controls are really nice. They're material themed. You're going to pull in other packages that kind of do stuff. So the reality is you're going to end up with a much larger application for anything bigger. But you do have the choice to kind of pick and choose. And there is kind of a bit of a herd mentality. People will kind of gravitate to the popular, and you'll end up kind of following that.
The popular thing changes every week.
I think it's probably every day, to be honest. It does change, but I think that's when you're experimenting, one thing I really like is you can just go into like wherever it was, I can't remember, like JS Fiddle and stuff like that, and you can really kind of quickly experiment. And then in fact the Vuetify site is a set of components, and Telerik, I don't know what they're like now. They had a set of controls, but they were kind of just wrappers on their existing controls. So they were quite poor in comparison to as a Vue experience to some of the other things. And there's Bootstrap Vue as well, which is it's a Vue native thing. So it's very much Vue first. So and it's kind of got that really nice experience with slots. I'm trying to find a nice control. Let's do select. So the really nice thing I think that Vue gives you, and I don't know if you might well get this with React, to be honest, but I can just open this up in CodePen, and I have the markup there, and I can start experimenting quite quickly to see if it will do what I want to do. And I don't have to necessarily, put it into my project and work out which packages I actually installed and do all that. You can kind of experiment and play about with it really easily. But then there's sometimes a bit of a mapping, because if you're using TypeScript, this is all obviously JavaScript, and you kind of got to then map. One of the things that we didn't really touch on, but when you're using the decorator for TypeScript, you end up with a much nicer syntax. I guess it's nicer relative and kind of opinion based. But you can see here that rather than kind of having the huge thing, I've just got this declarative component, and to define properties, I can just do @prop. So I don't have to build that complicated object syntax that you do when you're kind of just with pure JavaScript. These decorators will take your TypeScript and generate that object for you. So that kind of makes the experience a lot nicer, but I think it's kind of also important to understand the object syntax. Because sometimes I find like when I'm using all these helpers and all these kind of decorators, you detach from what Vue is and you kind of miss very subtle things, especially with Vuex. So Vuex is their state storage and their state management, and that would be a whole hour in itself, I'd imagine, but it's quite complicated and weird. But it's just that whole React props down, something down, events back up, and it disconnects that kind of life cycle. Yeah. Any other questions? Somebody totally put off it now? Not use it?
Looks nice and minimal.
It is nice and minimal. It's
But then, it's just the fact that it only goes so far, I think. So then you're back in the world of, well, which other bits do I use with it? And
Yeah.
how do I mix and match? Do you find the live write reload quite reliable? Because I think that's a really difficult problem that works for the simple cases, but not when you've got state on the client that is changing under its feet.
It's not too bad. I've not really encountered anything that has been particularly bad, but when I use it, it is kind of often pushing pixels and tweaking things. When it goes pear-shaped, like if you write any Duff code that I like, good old null reference type thing, it tends to break it and it will not reload, so you have to kind of refresh it again. It's really quite good if you're using the routing and you kind of go down this kind of branch of stuff, especially when you've got like separate views. Updating it is really nice for that, because you don't have to kind of worry about the stuff that's going over in this component. You can just focus on that component. It does work. I've not got angry at it too many times, so that's probably a testament to it.
Is there quite a lot? It's like vSwitch and vIf and vElses that are in there, because that seems quite not very declarative.
So vSwitch here is this control down here, so it's a switch control. So that's their component.
Okay, so it's not a switch thing.
So it's not, no, that is so typically the main part of the markup, the element, is a component, and then these are your directives.
VIF and vEls, that was...
They would be within, so in V4, the directives. I think when you're going to get into that fourth stage of the competence thing, you can kind of just read it. I mean, that is, I think quite nice. It's obvious. Writing that in Razor is a bit more tedious. Razor Pages not so much, I don't think now, but certainly Razor, it would be a bit weird.
Vue.js documentation is really good as far as kind of framework.
Yeah.
They go through, like, explain all that they've done, quite clear about the warnings, recommendations. Like, I think that you kind of mentioned about you kind of need to pull in other frameworks, for the routing or Vuex for storage. I think they work quite closely together with the community. So Vue will kind of, this is our recommended, people that packages, and it seems to be quite a good community.
Yeah, it is a good community. The documentation is really good. It's very dry. It's not dry, but what's really good about Angular is they've got that Tour of Heroes demo that you can kind of follow and build up something, and you kind of get a really good feel for it. I've not seen anything like that with Vue. They've got really good documentation. It's continually updated. It is really good demos, and most of the time you can switch away and you can try this, whatever that tool is. It is good. It does explain. I do find myself going back and reading it again and kind of getting it a bit more. You're kind of like going, I totally missed that first time. But yeah, the documentation is really good. The community is really good. This is a list of their awesome curated list, so you can see there's huge amounts of things. it's very unopinionated. Apart from everything should really be together, and I think that's kind of the nice thing about it. But then some people say that's the not nice thing, I guess.
And this word reactive, I'm going to be showing my real ignorance here as well, but you hear it a lot. Does that really just come down to it observes the data and it updates itself?
Yeah.
That's all it is?
That's all it is. Yeah. So it's basically like, I can't even remember what it is in .NET now. The I notify property change type thing, and when you have it in XAML, it's like, you know, Silverlight it totally nailed that kind of thing as well. It's exactly the same thing, and it's got this sneaky shadow DOM that is lurking in the background. That
that's just all about updating the DOM all at once for performance reasons rather than after every tiny change.
yeah, it will batch it. So there's essentially a cycle. So if loads of things happen, not all of those things will immediately be reflected. They'll kind of get batched up, and then whatever tick, I don't know how often those ticks are in reality, but it will then update the client.